Welcome to GV247.tv, the Global Vision Channel, a non-profit web TV channel bringing biblical perspective to the world in which you live.
Matthew's Gospel was written by one of Jesus' 12 disciples, Matthew, the tax collector, and particularly emphasizes Jesus as king. It's divided into sections so that there are 5 big sections of Jesus' teaching, and each of them ends with the same phrase, which is when he had finished these words. And it alternates between teaching and action. And then at the beginning you've got Jesus' birth, and at the end you've got his death and resurrection. There are various themes going through Matthew's Gospel. One of them is God's presence, where Matthew 1, it will talk about Jesus being Emmanuel, or God with us. Matthew 18, verse 20, it will talk about where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there I am in the midst. And the Gospel ends with Jesus saying, I am with you to the end of the age. Kingdom is a very big theme, and fulfillment of the Old Testament is a very big theme. A couple of the things that are signalled at the beginning is the opening of Matthew's Gospel is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of Abraham and son of David. And so David is the king, and Abraham is the father of many nations and the father of Gentiles. So in the genealogy at the beginning of Matthew, we'll talk about how there are non-Jews in the genealogy leading to Jesus, and the whole gospel will end with the gospel going out, the challenge to take it out to all of the nations. So that's a very important thing in Matthew's gospel, that everyone is going to be reached. Mark's a gospel that presents Jesus through his actions particularly. It's got some teaching in Mark 4 and 13, some longer speech, but lots of it is presenting you with the question, who is Jesus? Who is this man who does these amazing things? It's written by Mark, who was not one of Jesus' 12 disciples, but he was someone who'd spent time in Jerusalem, and he was an associate of the Apostle Peter. He got his information from Peter, and he wrote his gospel based on that information. And it really is very condensed, gives you sometimes a little bit more detail when it's covering the same stories than Matthew. It gives you a bit more detail, but it's focusing on this question of who Jesus is, and presents him as the Son of God. That's there at the climactic point in the centurion under the cross, seeing him as the Son of God. One of the things that happens at the end of Mark's Gospel is chapter 16, verse 9. It ends very suddenly with the women going away from the tomb and saying nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And in many manuscripts, in fact most manuscripts, it has 12 extra verses which will talk about Jesus' resurrection appearances. And most modern translations are indicating that those verses they think were secondarily added because they're not in our earliest couple of witnesses in Greek, and they're not in some of the early translations of the book of Mark. What's interesting about what goes on there is that there is a level of chaos in that some manuscripts have those 12 verses, some have them with a mark beforehand or a little thing saying that these were only in some witnesses. Some have a shorter ending and then have those 12 verses. Some have the shorter ending, not those 12 verses, and you get some not having those 12 verses at all. And so what you get is a bit like an explosion. When there's been an explosion, you get a bit of chaos. And in the same way, what's going on with the manuscript in those 12 verses shows us that there has been no cover-up in the manuscripts of the New Testament. There's been no systematic destruction of ones that don't agree to some template. And that's really important because it gives us assurance about the other passages in the New Testament, that if anyone had tampered with a text or if there was anything strange going on, we would get some manuscript somewhere that would show us that. And so where all the manuscripts agree, we can have huge confidence in the New Testament. I think the most defensible position is the position that says that those last 12 verses are not part of the original of Mark's Gospel. Luke's Gospel was written by someone who wasn't a disciple of Jesus, one of his 12 disciples, but was a medical doctor, and he writes it, dedicating it to a high-ranking Roman called Theophilus. And he says it results from his own careful research over a long time, speaking to eyewitnesses and people who had followed Christianity from the beginning. And it presents Jesus fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. It presents many parables and much of his teaching. It presents him in a very good way for an inquirer, someone who wants to know, how can I be sure about Jesus? Then it gives a lot in relation to that. It's one of the most varied of the Gospels in terms of the different range of teaching that it has. It begins with some contrast between the birth of Jesus and the birth of John the Baptist. And often in the Bible, in the book of Luke, it will present characters in very interesting ways. So you get to see the characters around Jesus as well as Jesus himself. I think Theophilus was a high-ranking Roman, and I say that on the basis of the word most excellent, which is a phrase or a title used of him which would only be used of someone of a certain rank. That the name Theophilus does mean someone who loves God or God loves them. And some people have said, does that therefore mean it's symbolic of anyone who loves God? And I don't think that is the case. I think, obviously, that would make sense of them. It would be a possible interpretation, but I don't think it's a probable interpretation because, after all, books often did have patrons. They often had dedications, and both Luke and the book of Acts are dedicated to this individual. I think it makes more sense to have this as a high-ranking individual who has sponsored the publication of this work. John's Gospel is one of the Gospels alongside Matthew's Gospel that was written by an eyewitness of Jesus, and it presents Jesus as God himself who has come down into this dark world. It presents him as the light, and how the world is dark and therefore refuses to come to him, and how he takes on flesh in order to rescue us. It presents him through a series of I am sayings where he tells us who he is. Interestingly, it also has John the Baptist early on as a pointer to Jesus, and John the Baptist says, I am not the Christ. So whereas Jesus says, I am something, John the Baptist says, I'm not. And it presents him as the way, the only true way to God. He is the mouthpiece of God, the true representative of God on earth, the one who will judge the world, and so on. And when you get to his crucifixion, that is, of course, the most shameful thing that could ever happen to someone. And yet in John's Gospel, it's described as his glorification. That is, in other words, there is this extraordinary claim that just at the point when everyone would say that Jesus was being most shamed by his public execution, this was the point at which God was most vividly displaying his glory. So we have a paradox right at the very center, where it's telling us that God's way of showing himself and how amazing he is when he wins victory over evil precisely by going through the evil which was inflicted wrongly, unjustly on Christ as he was crucified. So it's a remarkable book. It's a book of great depth, lots of symbolism in the book too. The Book of Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles, is the account of the early years of the Christian church, probably about the first 30 years. The first half mainly focusing on Peter and how the gospel spread under him. The second half focusing on the life of Paul. And then as a whole, the narrative is telling you how the Christian message started in Jerusalem, spread out to the surrounding area of Judea, then went out to Samaria, and then to the farthest parts of the Roman Empire, getting ultimately to Rome. And the book is really part two of the work Luke Acts. So Luke's Gospel written by Luke and Acts also written by Luke, both of them dedicated to Theophilus. Acts also gives us a number of speeches so that we can see the Christian message being presented in different contexts. In a synagogue, we can see it being presented in front of people in Athens at the Areopagus. We can see Paul telling the story of his own conversion in two different contexts, as well as the actual account of the conversion itself. So you get many cameos of how Christianity was presented and how Christianity spread, and often faced opposition of an unreasonable kind, and the amazing miracles that the early Christians performed. So 21 out of the 27 books of the New Testament are letters, and they are arranged in two groups according to order of size. The first 13 are letters by Paul, with the longest first, that's Romans, followed by 1 Corinthians, which is slightly shorter. And whenever you get a pair of letters like 1 and 2 Corinthians, those are blocked together. Then we go Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. Arguably, Galatians and Ephesians could be in a slightly different order because Ephesians can be longer than Galatians. Then shorter than Colossians is 1 Thessalonians. Shorter than it is 2 Thessalonians. Then what we go is to private letters or personal letters, 1 and 2 Timothy, Titus and Philemon, again descending in order of size. Then we go to non-Pauline letters, beginning with the longest of those, which is Hebrews. The second longest is James. Third longest is 1 Peter, with 2 Peter accompanying it. The fourth longest is 1 John, with the 2 and 3 John accompanying it, and the shortest of all is Jude. So really everything is just going in descending order of size. So Romans is the longest letter of Paul and is written to a church that Paul hasn't yet visited in Rome, and is a big treatise on the whole of the Christian message, the place of Israel in God's thinking, how we are saved from our sins. And it also ends with some more personal messages, but the substance of it is the Christian message as a whole, and how it begins with how God's anger is revealed against sin. And then what's the answer to that? It's the revealing of God's righteousness as Jesus comes and dies in the place of our sin. The first 3 chapters really have the depressing message about how every human is caught up in sin in a very full way. And then going on from there to the solution about how there is a way of getting right with God, which isn't by working on what you do, it is by trusting in what he has done. 1 Corinthians seems to be responding to some specifics that the Corinthians have asked Paul about. But before it gets onto that, it does rebuke the Corinthians for the way that they have got divided amongst themselves and have started forming groups, some saying they're following Paul, some following Peter, some following Apollos, others following Christ. And he says, look, there is only one Christ, and we need to follow him, and that the message which he has chosen to use to reach the world is the message of the cross, which really looks foolish to people who are looking for something wise, and it's a stumbling block to people who just don't like the fact that God should show his glory in such a shameful way. Then he responds to various questions they've raised about marriage and singleness, about what to do with eating and things sacrificed to idols, about how to run church services, and particularly about the subject of the special gifts that God's given for the church, miraculous gifts that God's given for the church, and then on the subject of the resurrection, where he speaks at length. So it goes with those topics. In 2 Corinthians, Paul explains why he hasn't visited the Corinthians when he said that he would. It's one of his most personal letters, very emotional letter, in which he gives an account of that. And he also explains to the Corinthians how they should be giving people, how Christ himself gave so much for us. And he also then, at the end of the letter, deals with the whole question of weakness and how we are able to work and have God's power most effective on us when we are weak. And he contrasts that with people he calls super apostles, who seem to be trying to combine the Christian message with a lifestyle of making great impression through glamour. Galatians is a pretty sharp letter. It's one letter where Paul doesn't write and commend the people he's writing to for doing things right. And he is really telling them off for abandoning the core Christian message by allowing themselves to go away from the idea that they are saved through Christ's work alone and thinking that they need to do all sorts of aspects of the Jewish law in order to get right with God. And he says, look, you've got to understand that God's promises came first to Abraham. The law came later. So if you try and make it so that God working and saving people depends on the law, you're getting the order fundamentally wrong. God's way of working at its most fundamental is working through grace and through promise, not through people following a set of rules. And he's really criticizing those who are trying to Judaize the Christian message and say that you get saved through following those rules. Ephesians says that God has the most amazing plan, which has gone on from deep eternity and which is involving every resource in the universe in order to make Christ visibly the head of all things, and that he is adopting people as his own children into his family so that Christ can be firstborn and have the others as brothers and sisters alongside him, and that they will have full inheritance alongside him. And it also tells about how you would never have guessed, but that God has all along been planning that the Gentiles, the non-Jews, should have an equal inheritance with the Jews as they come and are adopted into the family. And this was the surprise which has been intended from eternity past, but which no one throughout the entire Old Testament period would have possibly guessed, that God was actually going to make them part of one single body with one set of promises. And that's what he's actually delivering on in the time of the New Testament. So this is an amazing surprise, how there have been barriers between Jews and Gentile, and God's broken them down because of what he's done on the cross, because his aim is to have Christ as the one head of the one body, which is the church. He then explains in the second half of the letter how practically the church needs to live, going away from evil deeds and being properly ordered in the household. So that's what Ephesians is about. Philippians is a letter which is written by Paul from prison, in which he talks about how it's wonderful that he, being in prison, is being a great opportunity for Christianity to spread. Some people are preaching for all sorts of wrong motives, but at least they're preaching the message. The message is going out. And he appeals to the Philippians to be humble and accept the mindset that Christ had, who, though he had so much with his Father, gave that up in order to be humbled. And as a result, he is given the name above every name. Everyone will bow to him. And he tells the Philippians to accept the lordship of Christ and to rejoice and be unified together through having his attitude. Colossians, in many ways, is like a twin letter to Ephesians. It has many of the same themes, and it's trying to help the Colossians to fend off some false teaching that they've been given. They're being dragged away from the simple following of Christ to think that they need to get into philosophies and special experiences with angels and so on. And perhaps some of them are wanting to observe particular religious days and ceremonies. And what they're being told in Colossians is that really Christ has done away with that all, and that you need to accept him as the head over everything. 1 and 2 Thessalonians are letters written to a group of Christians that Paul had only spent a few weeks with in northern Greece, in Thessalonica, and he's explaining to them about how they should live, and particularly he's focusing on how Christ is going to come back. He needs to explain to them that doesn't mean you should stop working, and don't think that this is necessarily going to happen immediately, because there will be other things that have to happen first. So in 2 Thessalonians 2, he explains that there has to be a turning away that happens first, but he is preparing Christians for a lot of suffering that they will experience as they seek to follow Christ. 1 and 2 Timothy are letters written by Paul to this church leader, Timothy, who's actually seems to be in charge of several churches, and he's telling Timothy how to conduct himself, how to deal with error, about order in the church, how to appoint leaders in the church. This is all in 1 Timothy. How to deal with rich people, how to deal with widows, how to deal with all sorts of different situations. 2 Timothy is really Paul's last letter, in which he says, look, I've run the race, I've fought the fight, I'm handing the baton on now. And he talks about the wonderful promises that there are to those who follow Christ right to the end. He also has some very touching personal elements where he talks about opposition he's suffered and just simple physical needs that he has. So it's got more personal details about what Paul is doing than almost any other letter. We don't know much about Timothy. We read about him in the book of Acts and how he had a Jewish mother and grandmother that's mentioned in 2 Timothy as well, and about how he was brought up knowing the scriptures, and that's the route he's followed to Christian leadership. Titus is a letter by Paul to Titus to tell him about how he can help with the churches in Crete, and the specific situations they're dealing with there, how they need to develop a system of having older people discipling younger people, men to men, women to women, and how Christ has done such amazing things in showing his magnanimity towards us. A lot of the language there is actually political language, which relates to how Christ has rescued us, is a greater deliverance than any political deliverance you could ever have. Philemon is a letter from Paul to Philemon, who used to have a slave called Onesimus who had run away, and is telling him to accept Onesimus back, not as a slave, but as a brother, and saying that this is really what Philemon ought to do, is applying quite a bit of pressure to him, because once you recognise what Christ has done for us, and even what Paul has done for Philemon, there shouldn't be any question that he should do this. Hebrews is a long treatise. It's almost like a sermon. It's a mix between a letter and a sermon, really, and it's telling people who might be inclined to try to go back to Judaism without Christ, or to go back to rituals as a way of getting to God, that actually Christ is better than all of these things. He's better than the Old Testament rituals. He's better than the angels. He's better than the priests. Because at each point, when you consider his credentials, you see actually what the Old Testament things are actually shadows. They're actually things that point to Christ. Christ is the real fulfillment. And we need to put our trust in him. It also has a number of warning passages, warning people from turning away. People can often be tempted to turn away from Christ, and these warning passages are very serious and say there is a danger if you turn away that you might never be able to come back. James is a letter probably written by the half brother of Jesus, James, who was also a son of Mary, someone who's mentioned therefore in the Gospels and in the book of Acts. And he is writing to Christians with very practical advice on how to go about their Christian lives. He emphasizes their need to depend on God for wisdom, how God has done amazing work, and their need to listen and act rather than teach. Practically, that means, of course, not showing favoritism, just favoring rich people within churches. He expounds some texts in the Old Testament that people might have thought meant that if you just have belief and don't actually have action, then things are okay. And he says, look, the devils have belief but don't act following God. So clearly we need to have faith and works together. He's using the word faith in a somewhat different way from the way Paul sometimes uses it, because he's using it simply to mean belief without action. And that's very consistent with the underlying message of Paul, that belief needs to lead to action. According to the historian Josephus, we have an account of how James was killed. It describes how he was killed because he was accused to be a breaker of the law, and that's very consistent with the Christian account that he was a leader in the early church. And so he died about 30 years into the church, after having been leader in Jerusalem of the church. He was killed by fellow Jews because of his adherence to Christ.
This is GV247.tv, bringing biblical perspective to the world in which you live. A powerful free resource with hundreds of short films on a wide range of Bible topics from experts around the world, plus full-length sermons and programs for teaching and encouragement. Choose from current affairs, signs of the times, a chance to voice your own opinion, and special offers on our full-length feature films, documentaries, and study materials. At over 4 hours in length, the Lamplight Project is a systematic 12-part Bible study series, a powerful teaching tool that begins with the origins of life and takes the viewer on a comprehensive journey packed with high-profile interviews, film, graphics, and illustrations, concluding with the return of Christ and an encouragement to stand firm and be faithful. Complete with a free study guide download for both personal and group study, this powerful interactive guide connects to over 1,000 programs with expert interviews on GV247.tv, our free service web TV channel. Does My Life Have Meaning? A powerful 1-hour presentation produced from the Lamplight Project. With a free copy of the Gospel of Luke, this film is crammed with engaging interviews, film and graphics, a life-challenging film to those searching for answers. As distributors for the Jesus film, we offer this timeless movie based on Luke's Gospel. This clear presentation of the life of Jesus Christ has been viewed worldwide and translated into over 1,200 languages. We provide the film with a free copy of the Gospel of Luke. The Daniel Project is a popular TV documentary that presents an overview of Bible prophecy and an encouragement to read the signs of the times. Hailed as one of the best TV films to be made on the subject, DVD extras feature a heart-to-heart interview about the way of rescue. Based loosely on the documentary, The Daniel Connection is a full-length feature film. This fictional thriller incorporates many of the themes promoted through pop culture and social media which affect people on a global scale. Launched at the Cannes Film Festival, The Daniel Connection points the ever-skeptical viewer to search the Bible for answers to life's deepest questions. We've been serving the body of Christ for over 30 years, and if you would like further information, please do not hesitate to get in touch.